So, Tyrene, give us a quick lowdown on this book.
Okay.
I've been waiting for that for a long time.
Right. So the book is essentially a sketch, a historical and a biographical sketch of Washington's role in Africa, and which is pretty much clandestine and unknown for the most part. Most people know about Booker T. Washington's American exploits and position as an accommodationist. They don't see him as a radical figure or even as a Pan-Africanist or anyone who had anything to do with the Pan-African world or the African world at all. They see Du Bois, more or less as the Pan-Africanist. But Washington had a clandestine life, which involved him propagandizing against the atrocities in the Congo Free State under King Leopold. Also included, propagandizing and denouncing colonialism in South Africa, right? He also played a major role in negotiations to save Liberia, which was only one of two independent African nations on the continent at that time. And so this period is 1895 to 1915, which is also what I would consider our nadir, our lowest point in this country. But also the final case in the book is about the African Exclusion Measure, where Washington uses the Tuskegee machine, his secret network, to debunk and protest a measure that was designed to exclude people from Africa or African people coming from anywhere in the world into the United States, immigrating into the United States. So in effect, the measure was designed to lock the doors to people of African descent, African people, Black people, anybody who could be seen as part of the African world family, so on and so forth. And so all of this happened primarily behind the scenes, clandestinely, and is revealed in his personal papers, which are my primary source for the research and the work that I did on the book and on his life. And so I'm saying essentially that all of those events and his relationships, he had a lot of relationships with African nationalists, John Dube, Semi of South Africa, founding members of the ANC. He actually had corresponded with, and they exchanged very intimate details about the nature of the struggle on the African continent. And what I'm arguing essentially in the book is that this helped him develop into a Pan-Africanist. He's not in 1895, but 1915. He is a very well-developed Pan-Africanist as a result of all of these experiences. And he falters some at different moments, because there is the Togo expedition where Tuskegee graduates go and participate in a cotton expedition or cotton experiment in Togo. But after all of these experiences and relationships, he basically comes out on the other end as a pronounced Pan-Africanist who, in the final moments of 1915, when the African Exclusion Measure is coming before the House of Representatives, he doesn't falter, he doesn't flinch, he knows exactly what he needs to do in terms of advocating for African people internationally, not domestically, internationally. He identifies with Africans on the continent in Central and South America and the Caribbean. And that's who the measure really was directed at, not at African people from the continent, because there wasn't a large number of African people coming from the continent at that point in time. And so I'm arguing essentially that he develops into a Pan-Africanist, and this is that story.
He was also helpful to some Pan-Africanist leaders, Marcus Garvey, for instance.
Yeah, absolutely. That's in the book as well. Right.
Now, you went to Tuskegee yourself.
Oh, I went to Tuskegee, yes.
Tuskegee.
Yes, I'm an alumni.
Tuskegee. You're an alumni of Tuskegee. So how is it that you came across this story? Make it short.
Right.
And also use it as an opportunity to tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you do have a PhD in history.
Yes. No, in public policy. It makes sense that I'm looking at these policy cases in Washington stories. Washington story, the Liberian Crisis, which was a policy case, of course, and then the African Exclusion Measure, which is also another policy case. But yes, I'm a proud Tuskegee alumni. and I was a history student. I was a student of history there, and that's probably the first time that I come across Washington as something out of the ordinary, because we all come there with the typical perspective that Washington was an accommodationist. Even though we go to the school, we all say all the things that everyone else says in American society about Booker T. Washington. So and we're forced to read his biography up from slavery, autobiography up from slavery. But the point is that as a student of history, I had access to something called the lynching files, and I did a presentation on that. And what it was a collection of lynching articles on lynchings that took place in the United States from 1895 to 1915 that Washington himself had collected as a result of subscribing to all the newspapers in the United States, and they were delivered to them, and he would cut out and save all the documented cases of lynchings. And I just thought to myself, this guy, someone who's like a accommodationist, who's not opposing white domination and doesn't fight for social and political rights in this country. This is unusual that he's even collecting and compiling this kind of information. And so that was the first time I had a thought that he's not who people really think he is. But it's much later on, when I wrote my master's thesis in history, I actually had a chance to uncover and see that he had many relationships with African nationalists. And it was Manning Marable who wrote about that in an article called Booker T. Washington and African Nationalism. And he pretty much gives you a laundry list of Washington's African nationalist affiliates and Pan Africanist affiliates, and really does drive home that the Tuskegee always had guarded support for black nationalists. So
the conversation that we were having today in terms of South Africa, what's going on in South Africa and what's going on in Nigeria, right, and the conversation that we're about to start having about the International Decade for People of African Descent. Yeah. And I can't help but imagine that we are having this conversation about Booker T. Washington. In the past year alone, there's been a lot of conversations about two people. It's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and we now see the ascendancy, or I should say the reappreciation of Malcolm X. Okay. And the new conversations that we're now beginning to, the new appreciation that we're now beginning to have for Malcolm X and his contributions to our liberation struggle. Oftentimes, Booker T. Washington has been paired with his peer, who was also a very important player and thinker, Dr. Du Bois. So it's an extraordinary thing, I think, that we're now in a world where we can have these conversations. I grew up learning about those two, so it's either or. Okay. Right? It's either you follow Dr. Du Bois or you follow. That's the way. That was the dichotomy. That was the way it was presented to us. Right. So given everything else that is going on in the world today, that we now have an African American person as the president of the United States. Yeah. There's some reckoning going on in there. And we also have that situation where President Obama has to be placed next to these people, to these great minds. We're constantly comparing him to them.
Well, let me just say this. First, I take a non-traditional approach to Du Bois and Washington, in the sense that I say that it's neither. In terms of Pan-Africanism, neither of them influence how the other develops as a Pan-Africanist. And most, like I said before, of Washington's development as a Pan-Africanist takes place clandestinely. These aren't things that he announces. These are things that he does, to his own satisfaction, and does not necessarily announce it to the world. We only know these things, these facts about his life as a result of his personal papers. And I think other scholars basically, this is kind of where I come in at. There are scholars who have dealt with this in very short pieces, and then there are scholars who have had the lion's share of the task and failed to define what his relationship with Africa and in African affairs meant, right? And you have a handful of scholars who, Michael West, or Hagby, a few others who, Robert Norrell doesn't talk about his Washington in Africa, but talks about what has happened with Washington's legacy and how essentially we miss some very important things about him. But in terms of the overall work, yes, it's a piece that can give us some very interesting clues and models for how to deal with the world we live in, like the Liberian Crisis. It was a shrewd negotiation between Washington and U.S. officials on the fate of Liberia. And without a doubt, Washington is aligned with Liberia and interested in protecting its survival from French, British, and German encroachment at the time. And it begins in 1907, and the case follows through to 1912, where there's a resolution. But in terms of policy, so you said before, you have a PhD. Yes, it's not in history, it's in public policy. Actually, I don't go hard on the policy end in the book because it is really just for people who can consume history. I'm not really, although I address scholars, I'm not really talking to scholars. I'm talking to those of us who can consume regular historical narrative and
but it is nonetheless adding to the conversation. That's the more important thing. It's like we're now able to look at some of those people in the past, our past, some of the leaders in our past, and see them from different dimensions, and understand things about them that we never knew before. So the conversation is changing. And
so with Washington, we can invoke these models for today because it's very interesting. I mean, particularly regarding Africa, we expect, if we were to superimpose it on today, we have some expectations of Obama because he is, without a doubt, an African person, or at least, very least, an person of African descent. I don't know how he personally identifies. I know he considers himself black. I heard him say, when he's in New York, nobody says, hey, look at the mixed guy waving a cab down. They say, there goes the black guy. So he does know that much. Now, how much he's at least he's in perspective about that, right? Nobody says, don't stop, the mixed guy is waving for a cab. He said, his response to why he doesn't say mixed every day is because, in New York, he's just a black guy looking for a cab that's not going to stop. So my point is that he has some connection to Africa, and we have some expectations of him as a result of that. But all of those things involve some serious negotiations in the modern world. And so in my book, I talk about what are the final resolutions to a case like Liberia that ensures its survival, but also puts it in a very precarious position in relationship to the U.S. and what the deal was, meaning that the U.S. got to put a station, a military base there. Then you have the establishment of Firestone and a host of other things that go along with bailing Liberia out of this crisis of encroachment by these colonial forces on the ground in Africa. So, it's not a win. There's no heroes, but it's just, as some other scholars that I know, it's survival culture, how we survived. What did he do to allow the survival of this independent African nation, one of only two on the continent, at a time where European nations were intolerant of African independence and felt as though any independent African nation should be seized if another European nation did not put its stakes on it,
Yeah.